Hello everyone. In this snippet video, I will showcase how to create and control gradients within Adobe Animate. This is one of the most overlooked features of the program, and it's one of the things that most students ask me about because, thinking in terms of Photoshop or Illustrator, it's something that is secondhand to me, so I sometimes forget to hone in on what you can do and how you can manipulate the gradients within Animate. So let's get started. What I want to do now is I want to go ahead and create I'm going to change the color to a solid color to begin with, and I'm going to create a box, a rectangle on the stage. Now this is just a rectangle fill. As you can see, it is just a shape, so there's nothing in it but the fill. And what I want to do is I want to change the value of that fill from red to a gradient. So as you know, we have options whether we want to click on the front color, having the swatch selected, and pick a color, or we can pick a color from our swatches, including the gradients at the bottom. You also have the ability, let me undo that, to do it by clicking on the fill swatch under the library, under the properties for that particular thing. Or, let me undo that, you can always go to the fill swatches over here and pick a color. Remember, for all of these, I had the fill selected in order for it to activate. So with that done, I can go ahead and now have that fill, that gradient done. I can go ahead and what we did in the past was we went to the color palette, and you notice that down here we have the gradient selected for that particular option that we have selected for the fill on the stage. So we could now either change the position of the beginning and end colors on that slider. We can also add new colors if we so desire onto that particular gradient, and we can save those swatches by those gradients by adding them to our swatches if that's what our intent is. Now, what else can we do over here? Well, besides the adding and removing, you can also select swatches independently, double click them to access, a swatch panel to change the colors to something that you want within the preset colors that you have in your swatches panel. Or you can select any of the swatches on that bar and change the opacity of them, so you can make them transparent if you want to. You can also enter values by hue, saturation, and brightness, or by RGB values. Up here, you notice that by default we chose a linear gradient. If I click on that drop-down menu, you notice that we have, besides a linear gradient, we also have radial gradients and bitmap fill. Radial gradients are exactly what they are on the other programs. They create a gradient from the center out, and they go from the left to the right on the colors. You can always affect them by also changing the position of the swatches, and as you can see, basically you're changing the orientation of your gradient on the object that you have selected. Okay. Besides these options, which are pretty familiar with from other programs, we also have the ability to select whether we want this to be reflected color or if we want repeat color. Now, what does that mean? Well, this works in combination with the gradient tool under your tools box. Now, if your gradient tool is not available to you in your interface, you see these three little dots down here. If you click on them, you have an array of tools that are hidden within your tools box. That's because this will occupy a lot of space, including things like the bones and the line width and all that stuff. So you would probably find it in here, the gradient tool. All you need to do, let's say for example I don't have it. Let me go ahead and close this, and let me remove that tool from here. If I want to just put it back somewhere, I can just go ahead and drop it into this area, and you'll notice that it disappears from my interface under the tools box. So by the same token, if you don't have it, simply click on those buttons, find the tool, click it, and drag it to a space within your toolbar, whatever you want to drop it. In this case, I want to put it here, and then close those tools, and now you have the tool available to you. Now, when I select that tool under my tools box, you'll notice that I have this little gadget. This is a gizmo that appears around my gradient. So let's go back and open up the color palette and see what we can do with this. I am going to choose radial gradient for now, and I want to choose the repeat color option. So when I click on that, actually, let me make it not a radial, let me make it linear first to start with that. And then I'll choose the repeat color. So with that done, you'll notice that my gizmo changed because it's not radial anymore. You notice that I have a little icon here with an arrow that allows me to increase or decrease the size of my gradient, but my object doesn't change size, so it's only affecting the gradient. You will also notice that as I decrease or decrease, I am repeating, which is what I told it to do under the palette, to repeat the color. So as I decrease, I repeat the color. With that, so that we can see what that is, let me go back to the color palette and switch from repeat to reflect. And you'll notice that it's now reflecting my gradient. If I don't choose reflect, I choose the last one, linear, it just simply increases or decreases the size of my gradient by extending the beginning and end colors on my gradient. Okay, so that's what that does for you. Go back to that one. Let's do the repeat. And let me now go ahead and move to that circle anchor that I see on the gradient tool, on that little gizmo that activated when I clicked on the gradient transform tool. So this one resizes. This one allows me to rotate my gradient inside my object. Notice that the object remains the same. The object is the rectangle, it hasn't changed. But I am manipulating the actual gradient inside that rectangle. So I can rotate and change the position of the gradient within the rectangle. I also have that transform gizmo that I have in my symbols when I create a symbol. So I can click on, drag on that and reposition my gradient within my artwork. So I have quite a lot of flexibility when setting up gradients inside fills. So now let me go back, switch my linear gradient to a radial gradient and see what that gives us with those options that we have here. So linear is linear. So if I increase, sorry, let me undo that really quick. If I use this one here, notice that this one allows me to expand my gradient. This one with the little arrow. This one allows me to rotate my gradient, which right now is not doing anything because it's centered. This one allows me to increase or decrease the width of the gradient. So it's a very handy tool in order to morph the shape of a gradient. So sometimes we have an ellipse and we put a gradient and we want the gradient to match the ellipse, but by default the gradient looks like a circle. So if I want to resize it to look like an ellipse, I can go ahead and match it by doing this and then rotating my gradient to the position that I intended to be. You will also notice that I have an arrow right next to the transform tool. So I have the transform tool that allows me to move my transformation point, and I have this little arrow. If I click on the arrow, I can move the origin, the beginning point of my gradient, wherever I want. And it allows me, within that line, it allows me to create neat effects, because notice that it almost looks like it's pushing from out there outward in that direction. So it sort of deforms the way the gradient appears on the screen. Like I said, giving you a lot of flexibility as to how you can work with these tools. Now you can combine that with the other options under the color palette. So say for example I want reflected color in this case. Let me decrease the size of my gradient and you'll notice what happens when I do that. Let me switch from reflected to repeat. You'll notice that I have really cool options on what I can work with my gradient when I combine those tools. So this is basically a short brief on what you can do with gradients in order to manipulate them, how to create them, and how to manipulate gradients within Adobe Animate.